On a wet November afternoon, the house sounded like it was holding its breath. The hallway bulb flickered like a tired eye, and the father told himself this would be quick, just a few nails, a little fix. Then he could leave. He had put it off for years. The warped floorboards by the front hall had annoyed every realtor who'd walked through, the nails standing up like small insults, the wood bending like a wave. He promised to fix them before listing, promised the bank, promised himself. But the house had a way of pushing him back to the door. It wasn't just the lakes or the draft. It was the memory that clung to the corners, the shape of a life that had stopped in place. He swallowed, tasting dust and old varnish, and set the pry bar under the first board. The metal squeaked, the wood groaned. Rain whispered against the windows. He shifted his weight and pressed. The nail wouldn't sit flush, it fought him. His hands, scarred and patient from years of working with wood, found the stubborn rhythm. Up a hair, down, twist. He moved to the next plank. The bulb buzzed overhead. The air smelled like damp wool and attic heat, even though the furnace was off. He told himself not to think about the pink room at the end of the hall. He told himself not to think about the last night he had tucked her in. The pry bar snagged on a board near the foot of the stairs, the one that always made visitors stumble. He leaned in and felt the wood lift just a little. The sound that came back wasn't the solid thud of joists. It was hollow, thin, like knuckles on a door you don't want to answer. He paused, breath steaming white in the cold hall, and tapped again. Hollow. The house, which had always seemed too full of silence, gave him a reply. He widened the gap. Dust lifted in a low cloud and drifted across his face, tasting bitter like smoke left in an old coat. Beneath the plank lay a cavity barely deeper than his wrist. Inside it, something wrapped in brown paper waited, a neat parcel sealed with a knot of string and blobs of candle wax poured thick and soft, long since gone dull. He stared. The string looked like someone had tugged it tight with a child's stubborn strength. The wax held the faint shape of a thumbprint. He brushed a corner with his knuckle and felt a stickiness that didn't make sense after so many years. Maybe it was just memory playing tricks. His fingers shook as he lifted the parcel out. The paper made a dry whispering sound against the wood like leaves. He sat on the first stair and set the bundle on his lap. The bulb murmured overhead. Somewhere outside, a truck shifted gears and idled steady and low, the sound rolling under the house like distant thunder. He froze without knowing why. Then very carefully he cracked the wax with his thumb, untied the string, and unfolded the paper. It was a diary, small. The cheap kind sold at the grocery store, pastel cover bleached to a sad gray, edges blackened as if it had kissed the edge of a candle flame too many times. A tiny brass lock had long ago snapped off. He opened it. The first page had been dated in a careful, neat hand, the week she vanished. He saw the numbers and felt the floor tilt. He saw the tight little loops of her letters, the way she had taught herself to make her lowercase g with a long tail because she thought it looked like a cat. His throat closed, he read. There were drawings in the margins, simple boxes, and a little bell with lines around it to show it was ringing. There was a window drawn as a square with a heavy shade, a truck with a square nose, a girl with a round face and stick legs. The words were plain, easy, each one packed with the weight of a child trying to be exact. Today I found a door that is not a door. It looks like wall, but it is not wall. There are bells under the stairs. They ring when I try to count slow. Rule: do not look out the window when the truck idles. He didn't realize he had moved closer to the lamp until the light buzzed over his cheek. He could smell the paper, a dry warmth like the inside of an old book in a church thrift store. He turned the page with the care of someone lifting a bird with a broken wing. Another entry, the same week. The handwriting trembled but kept its neat lines. He could hear her voice in it, high and soft, the way it used to sound when she was proud of spelling a new word. He could see her tongue peeking out of the corner of her mouth while she drew. He remembered the search parties, the maps on the dining table, the posters printed too dark, the first ones, then reprinted lighter because the eyes looked kinder that way. He remembered the smell of coffee that had gone bad in a pot, the way neighbors tried to fill him with words because silence made them afraid. He remembered listening for a sound he didn't know, a clue he wouldn't recognize until it was past, like a bell that rings just once and then is gone. He read the next line again, a door that is not a door. He looked up at the wall at the bottom of the stairs, at the way the baseboard didn't quite meet the plaster. He had painted that baseboard twice. He had moved the coat bench against it and then away and then back like a man rearranging his guilt. The board he'd just pried had a strange cut along its edge. He had never noticed, or he had noticed and told himself it was nothing. Under the stairs, bells. He slid a hand along the dark space where the plank had been. His palm came back gray. He felt for nails for a seam. He found only splinters and old spider silk. He closed his eyes and saw the sketch of the bell, little lines for sound. He had hung bells on the back door once when she was small and kept trying to sneak out to the porch to feed bread to the crows, not under the stairs, on the door. He had taken them down the winter after she disappeared because the sound made his heart seize. The truck outside changed its idle, a rough cough, a thick voice. He felt the diary in his hands and without meaning to turned his head toward the window. The shade was half down, the glass shivered with the rain. In the reflected light he saw himself, a man who had not left because leaving felt like telling the world it could keep her. He lowered his eyes and kept reading. Bells ring under when I crawl. I have to count to 10 before the cold comes in. If I go slow, the bells tell. If I go fast, the bells don't tell. I made a map. She had drawn a rectangle, shaded a corner, and drawn a small star there. He pressed his thumb to the star and heard the faintest chime in his head from a night years ago, a sound at the edge of sleep, the thought that a mouse had run across a spoon. Memory has a way of knocking and pretending to be nothing. He flipped forward. The entries did not go far. A week, then 3 days, then a gap. Some pages were smeared as if tears had fallen and dried there. One had a circle pressed so hard the paper almost tore, the moon maybe, or a tiny round window. He swallowed. He felt the shake in his teeth. The bulb hummed a little lower, as if it too was tired of keeping watch. He looked down the hall. The door to her room was closed. He had not opened it in months. The scent of her shampoo was long gone, but sometimes, after a storm, the carpet there smelled like the lake where they used to walk on Sundays, a soft green smell that made his chest ache. He stood, then sat again. He felt too heavy to rise, too full of the past to move without spilling. He bent over the hollow again and brushed the edge with the back of his hand. There was a notch, shallow, like a finger groove. He pressed. Something gave, not much, just a sigh of wood. He held still and counted to 10. He didn't know why he counted, he just did. At 10, he heard it, a faint, far jingle as if a bell at the back of a drawer had stirred in its sleep. He stopped breathing and counted again. The sound did not return. He sat back with the diary and let the silence fill in around him. Rain ticked against the porch rail. A car hissed by on the wet street. Somewhere a dog barked twice and quit. He remembered holding her tiny hand on the first day she wrote her name in chalk on the sidewalk. He remembered the delighted look on her face when she learned that each letter had a sound, and if you lined them up right, the world spoke back. He turned the last page of the week and found a short line in the bottom corner. I can hear you upstairs. It's okay. I am brave. It was written in a smaller hand, as if she'd been hiding while she wrote it, pressed into some tight space, drawing letters slow to keep them silent. He pressed his thumb to the words, then pulled it away, afraid of smearing the past. His breath fogged in the cold air and drifted away, a small ghost. He closed the diary and wrapped it back in the paper, not to hide it, but to hold it safe for one more minute. The truck outside eased away. The house creaked, then settled. He set the bundle beside him on the step and wiped dust from his hands onto his jeans. He had been afraid to sell the house because he feared it would forget her. Now he knew the house had not forgotten at all. It had kept something for him. It had waited. He stood at last and looked at the dark seam under the stairs, the stubborn plank, the hollow that had found him. He picked up the diary again and held it to his chest. He spoke her name aloud, the quiet way he had used when she was a baby and the night felt too big. The hall gave him back a soft, empty echo, and still in the pause that followed, he thought he heard a bell, not loud, not even clear. Just the idea of one, trembling somewhere under the wood, like the past taking in a breath before it speaks. Rain stitched at the window like a careful hand pulling the day shut, and the diary lay open on his knees like a wound that wouldn't close. He had pulled on latex gloves from an old first aid box, the blue rubber snug against his fingers, because now the pages were evidence and he did not want to leave his skin behind on her words. The ink looked fresh in places, darker at the edges as if it had never fully dried. He turned a page and felt the paper tug back as if it had something to say before it let him go. The smell rose up again, dust, a hint of bleach, a whisper of something sweet that should have been cookies cooling on a rack. He read the top line and heard her voice in his head, bright and fast. Jump rope today. Ashlyn counted wrong on purpose. Then a space, a new rhythm, spare and flat, rusted lock under stairs, cold metal, don't tell. He traced the sentence without touching it. The words were small, neat, the letters holding hands like children walking in a line. In the margins she had drawn a hopscotch grid and beyond it the start of a map. A rectangle for their block, a dot for their house. A crooked arrow toward the alley lights. He felt the shape of the street in his legs, the way it tilted toward the storm drain at the corner where leaves always gathered and spun. She had circled that drain. Twice. He swallowed and the gloves squeaked faintly in the quiet. He turned the page, the window shook with a strong gust. In the kitchen, a loose spoon rattled in a drawer. He kept reading. Under the doodles of jacks and jump ropes, the tone shifted again, cut short as if a hand had covered her mouth. Footsteps after midnight, not like Dad's, paused between steps, breathe in, breathe out, his own chest tightened. He could hear the old house breathing now, the boiler clicking, the fridge humming low, the long, slow sighs the walls made when rain pressed on them. He read the line again. Not like Dad's, he felt the words stick in his throat. He reached for the next page and somewhere near the living room a board complained, long and thin. It was the same creak he had heard that night. He knew its pitch by heart, the note it struck, the way it stabbed through sleep and pulled him upright before his mind understood. The sound moved through him like a cold finger. He looked up and saw the shadow of the hallway pulsing with the bulb's tired flicker. The house made that sound only once when you crossed the middle of the room. Old joist, bad nail. He had promised himself he would fix it 100 times and never did. He closed his eyes and the memory came back with all the edges still sharp. The officer's flashlight cutting across the living room like a blade, turning family pictures into white squares, making dust float like ash. The beam had found the coffee table, the couch where she used to crawl under the throws, the window with the shade half down and the damp edge where rain had come in. It moved on, searching the corners he had already emptied with shaking hands. He had hated that light and also begged it to find something. Anything? Now he opened his eyes and turned another page. The diary spoke in two tempos and he could feel his heart trying to march to both. Playful lists moved quick as a child at recess. Freeze tag winners, me Ashlyn Paya, Ms. D wore her funny shoes, I got 2 stars. Then the sentences that felt like messages tapped through a wall, smell of bleach, cookie tray cold, don't look out window when truck idles. The instructions sat there, small and loud. He looked toward the window, half expecting to see the shape of a truck pressed into the rain like a watermark. Only his own reflection stared back, thin and gray. He followed the map as it grew in the margins. Houses stacked along the street like teeth, a tiny church on the corner, a path traced behind the grocery, the arrow darting between the dumpster and the back fence. She had drawn the alley lights as 4 circles with halos. A dotted line ran from their porch to the storm drain and ended in a spiral. He leaned closer. She had printed beside it in her smallest hand, secret cold bell. He could not tell if she had meant the bell was cold or the secret was. He could feel both. He found a page where she had written a list of rules. Don't open the back door when the wind says my name. Don't tell secrets to the doll with the cracked eye. Don't look out the window when the truck idles. Don't step on the middle plank after bedtime. His skin prickled. He thought of all the times he'd told her house rules, simple ones meant to keep her safe. No running on the stairs. Don't touch the stove. Tell us if a stranger talks to you. How careful they had been in all the ways people are careful, until danger chooses a different door. He turned more pages. A smudge on one made a crescent like a fingerprint made by a tear. Another had a tiny pressed flower, brown and fragile, taped in place with the kind of narrow tape he kept in his desk for wrapping gifts. She had written, found this by the drain before the rain. It will die in the dark. He closed his eyes and saw her kneeling by the curb in her red rain boots, hair damp, serious as a scientist. He felt a pain so clean it stole the breath from him. He paused and listened. The house responded, pipes ticked, rain stitched. In the wall, a faint settling sound. He set the diary on the coffee table and stood, the gloves bright against the dim room. He walked the path the beam had taken all those years ago, from the front hall to the living room to the window and back. He stepped around the middle plank, then forced himself to step on it. It spoke at once, that long, thin cry. He stood and let the sound fade. Then he dropped to one knee and ran his fingers along the baseboard. A seam, he had missed it. He had missed so much. He went back to the diary and read it as if it could still change, as if a new ending might drop onto the last page. Her voice darted and clipped. Ms. D says write your 5 senses. The playground smells like pennies. Bleach again, a laugh that sounds like a cough, a key on a string. It lives in a pocket. He felt the shape of a key against his own thigh, remembered carrying the back door key on a shoelace tied around his belt the year she was born, because he kept losing it in the hectic fog of new parenthood. He had forgotten the feel of it hitting his leg when he walked. He had not forgotten the way her small hand slid into his when they crossed the street. He set the book down and walked to the hallway. He turned the light off. He stood in the dark and let his eyes adjust. The house, freed from the flicker, felt older but less tired, like a person who has finally stopped trying to keep up an act. Shadow laid itself along the baseboards and under the stairs. The sound of the rain grew clearer. He heard beneath it a drip from the kitchen sink. He noted it, the way an investigator notes small things that may add up later. He turned the light back on and returned to the diary with a notebook of his own. He wrote down the dates of each entry. He copied the rules, the quick reports. He sketched her map and added street names, alley widths, the position of the alley lights as they really were. He circled the storm drain on his page and underlined the words secret cold bell. He put a question mark by not like dad's. He forced himself to write in printed letters like hers, block, and plain, so he could see what she had seen without his cursive loops getting in the way. Rain gathered in the window track and spilled with a soft, wet click. When his hand cramped, he stopped and rubbed the ache out with his thumb. He looked around the room as if it were a scene he had just entered for the first time. The couch, the coffee table, the scuff where a toy truck had once rammed the baseboard and left a pale scar in the paint. He heard a car pass, tires whispering on wet pavement, and saw the flash of its headlights slide over the wall. For a second, the room looked like it had that night under the officer's light, stark, cold, exposed. The beam had searched for a person. Now he searched for a pattern. He packed the diary in a clean zip bag he found in a drawer. He labeled it with the date and time and the place he had found it, like the detective on TV had once told the camera to do. It felt strange and right. He carried the bag to the table and set it beside his notebook. He listened again for the creak and heard nothing. He listened for the truck and heard only rain. He laid his palm flat on the page where she had circled the storm drain and felt the thrum of his own pulse under the glove. The house had always been a place where life happened. Now it was a witness. The walls held stories he had not heard. The floor kept time like a metronome, the old plank ready to speak if he stepped in the right spot. He stood and looked toward the stairs, toward the seam under them, toward the drain marked on the map at the corner where leaves spun and the water talked to the dark. He felt the slow shift inside himself that meant he was no longer just a father with a box of flyers and a prayer. He was an investigator again. He picked up his notebook and the bagged diary, and the sound of the rain folded itself into a kind of steady drum, like a heart, like a clock, like a countdown he could finally hear. On a wind-bruised night, the diary changed its voice. The letters turned blocky and stressed, like a child trying to write inside a closet with the light off. And then a third hand crept in, tidy and cold, pressing rules into the page like orders cut from a stencil. He felt it in his fingertips before he understood it with his mind. The neat, playful loops he knew, hopscotch scores, lists of snacks, tiny hearts above lowercase i's, gave way to square, heavy letters that mashed into the paper. The ink bled at the corners as if the pen had been pushed too hard. And then between those strained lines, he found a new voice, tight, straight, and exact. No noise when the fan starts. Wait for the bell. Blue door only. Each sentence sat by itself, as if it didn't want to touch what came before or after. He imagined a hand guiding hers, stopping, correcting, tracing, the way you teach a child to print her name, only this was not a name. This was a plan. He put on fresh gloves and held the page under the lamp. The letters were tidy and evenly spaced, but pressed deep grooves he could feel through the latex. The words looked stamped, not a child's rhythm, not rushed, no fear in the strokes, only control. He breathed through his mouth, slow and shallow. The house gave a soft creak, that same thin note the center plank sang at night. He remembered the beam of the officer's flashlight cutting the room into bright and dark, the way it had sliced across his family pictures as if deciding what deserved to exist. He closed the diary carefully and slid it into a gallon bag. Evidence, not just memory anymore. Detective Hart's office still smelled like old paper and the bitter edge of stale coffee. The cold file exhaled when it opened, a dry sigh rising from worn manila, the metal fasteners green with age. On the wall, a faded flyer with his daughter's face looked at the door as if waiting for it to open. Hart was older now, hair thin at the crown, eyes tired in a steady way. He turned the diary gently, thumb traveling the edge without touching the ink. "Two hands," he murmured first, then tapped the page with a ballpoint pen capped tight. "And a third that doesn't belong to a child." They spread the papers out, early reports, call logs, a timeline printed in a font that belonged to a different decade. The rain had slowed, but the streetlight outside buzzed like a trapped bee, and moths kept tapping the glass with timid knuckles, small soft knocks he could feel in his teeth. Hart slid a legal pad between them and wrote the words from the stenciled notes one by one. "No noise when the fan starts. Wait for the bell, blue door only." "These are instructions," Hart said. "Someone is teaching her how to move through a schedule without being seen." He opened to the blocky pages again and traced the times she had started writing down in the margins. 2:11 a.m. hum starts. 2:13 cart wheels rattle. 2:15 bell one ring. 2:17 quiet hymn. The numbers looked like she had copied them from a digital clock she could not see, only hear counting in her head, checking a wall vent for the breath of a machine. The father wrote them beside the old police timeline. The original report had noted a loud engine sound heard by a neighbor sometime after 2, dismissed then as a passing truck. The word generator had been written once in pencil and then scratched out. Hart tapped 2:11 with his pen, not a truck, a generator warming up. He circled 2:13, cart wheels, not a grocery cart at that hour, custodial, hospital, school, church, basement. He listened as if the room were about to tell him the answer. "Blue door only," he said again, slower now. "Which door in this town is blue and matters at 2 in the morning?" The father closed his eyes and saw back halls, maintenance doors, emergency exits propped with wooden wedges. He remembered the church down the block, repainting its side entrance a bright sea blue 2 summers ago to cover graffiti that bled through. He remembered the school gym having a storm door the janitor complained about, chipped and always sticking in the rain. They overlay her notes with the day the hymns drifted through the floor. She had written the title phonetically, "Abide with me as a child would hear it," along with a little drawing of eighth notes floating like balloons. The father heard it now, that slow melody sliding down through beams when a late prayer group sang and the building carried it on. In the original canvas, a neighbor had told an officer she thought she heard church music somewhere around 2, but the box next to the note said unrelated. He saw the detective's jaw flex as he read that word. He felt the old anger like heat in his throat. "Someone taught her to wait for the bell," Hart said. "That could be a chime on a back door or the end of a dryer cycle in a laundry room or a service elevator bell." He underlined 2:15. "One ring is a floor. Blue door suggests an exit used by staff." He wrote the word keys and pressed the tip hard enough to dot the paper. "Who has keys at 2? Janitors, night guards, deliveries, maintenance, someone with a route. Someone who knows when the fan starts and when the hymn starts and when the cart wheels move." They fell into a slow, careful rhythm, 2 men building a bridge back to a night that had swallowed them both. The father turned a page and read a line that made his hand clench. "Practice writing with left hand," the block letters said, slant wrong, shaky as a branch. Below it in the tidy stencil voice, "Use right only for counting, do not smudge." Her thin hand had been trained to keep marks neat, not hers anymore but the schedule's. He thought of small fingers chafed by pencils, the way she used to blow on ink to make it dry faster, her breath a tiny storm over the page. Hart pulled a folder marked "Tips be closed" and fanned through slips the color of faded mustard. He found one, a maintenance worker fired from the hospital that same year for sleeping on shift. Another from a church volunteer who quit suddenly without a forwarding address. Another about a school custodian who swapped shifts often for cash. So many names, so many almosts. Hart wrote 3 columns, church, hospital, school, and started to slot times beside each like teeth lining up. 2:11 generator. Churches often run old boilers. Hospitals hum at all hours but a generator test, Thursdays. Schools maybe only in storms, 213-cart wheels. Hospitals, yes. Schools, yes. Churches, only if they set up chairs at dawn. They argued gently about sound. The father said the hum in the diary felt like the low, steady kind that nested in your bones. Hart said church basements had that old fans chewing air. They listened to the office itself, to the fluorescent light buzzing and the vent's breath, and they mapped what they heard against her notes. The streetlight popped once and both men flinched as if the room had fired a small shot. Then the buzzing came back, patient and thin, and the moths began tapping again. When their eyes blurred, they stopped. Hart capped his pen and leaned back the chair complaining. "It's not just what she heard," he said. "It's when she learned to listen for it." He tapped the tidy rules with his nail. Someone coached her. Someone told her the house's heartbeat and built her steps between beats. That takes time. It takes access. It takes a person who lives by a clock and carries keys without thinking. The father nodded. He thought of a ring heavy with brass teeth. The sound it made against a thigh in the dark. The way people with keys spin them in their hands when they wait. They bagged and labeled fresh copies. They marked a new timeline in bold black lines, the kind you could see from across a room. Hart slid the old flyer free and set it beside the diary, the girl's printed name under her picture and the date that had cleaved their lives. Outside, the moths kept testing the glass. One rested there, wings open, powder soft, as if trying to read the office through the pane. The father lifted the bagged diary and felt its small weight settle into his palms. He could smell the paper even through the plastic, ink, dust, and the thin sour trace of a bottle of bleach from a kitchen that was supposed to smell like sugar. He left the station near midnight. The streetlight above the curb hummed its one unbroken note. The moths tapped, tapped, tapped like shy hands asking to be let in. He stood under them with the diary clutched to his chest and pictured the house breathing, the fan turning, the bell giving one small ring in the dark. He understood now that his child had learned a new language under his roof. She had learned to write inside the clock. Somebody had taught her where to step and when to breathe. Somebody with keys. Somebody who followed a schedule down to the minute, like a hymn sung on the same beat every week. He started home with the pages warm against him, listening to the town's machines as if they might finally tell him a name. On a night that smelled like rain and old stone, they found the kitchen that had been waiting for them. The diary had promised soup and a hymn, and now the tiled floor squeaked under their shoes like a warning whispered through teeth. They came in through the side, not the main sanctuary doors, because the note said blue door only. The church had painted it a friendly color, bright even in the dark, but the handle bit cold into the father's palm. Inside, the hallway held the chill of a basement and the faint, sour breath of bleach. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, tired and uneven. Detective Hart swept his flashlight once, low and slow, as if he were afraid to wake the building. The beam slid over bulletin boards and a stack of folding chairs. It caught dust the way a net catches minnows. Somewhere above them, a pipe knocked, then went still. The kitchen door swung on a heavy hinge. The smell hit first, bleach, stainless steel, and a memory of onion and broth. The father's chest tightened at that because the diary had written soup like it was a landmark and not a meal. He stepped inside and felt the tile answer him with a wet squeak. The sound was exactly right. He looked at Hart, and Hart gave the smallest nod, the kind you give when a guest turns into a fact. Pot racks hung from the ceiling like a field of silver stars gone dull, ladles, slotted spoons, and a long whisk with a bent wire. The walk-in fridge rumbled in the corner, steady as a generator learning how to breathe. The father closed his eyes and counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. At 4, the fan inside the unit kicked a deeper note and Hart's pen tapped against his notebook. 2:11 hum. Soup and hymn practice, Hart said softly, repeating the child's words like a prayer. Shoes squeak on tile. His light swept to the far wall where a service hallway yawned into shadow. It ran behind the kitchen, a narrow throat lined with mop hooks and old schedules pinned under cracked plastic. A rusted padlock hung on a door halfway down, the loop crusted red like dried blood, its teeth pressed into a hasp that looked older than the paint. Few people would notice a door like that, and fewer would ask about it. Hart ran a fingertip over the lock without touching the metal. "This isn't on the site map," he murmured. The father could see it then, the way a person with keys walks right past the choir room and the pantry and the flyers about bake sales to this door. The way the padlock would look ordinary in the light of day and vanish in the busyness of soup lines and coffee urns. He followed Hart into the hall. Concrete breathed cold through the soles of his shoes. Their footsteps made soft echoes, and each one came back to them a beat later as if someone were walking just behind. He tried not to look over his shoulder. They stopped at the door. Up close, the wood showed the ribs of old repairs, patch over patch, paint over paint. The jam held a secret. Chalk marks, faint but stubborn, climbed from knee height to shoulder height in little hash lines, the way a child measures a secret life by stolen inches. The father's breath went thin. He lifted his gloved hand and held his palm above one mark, then the next, until he stood where the last line ended. It matched a height he remembered too well, the top of a blonde head when he bent to kiss it good night. He pressed his glove to the wood to steady himself, and the door answered with a dull, old man cough. Hart took out a small camera and a ruler. He worked with a patient calm the father had come to trust, lining the ruler under the highest mark, clicking the shutter, then sliding down to the lowest. He did not ask if the father wanted to look away. The father was grateful for that. He watched the flash bounce off the padlock and jump to the steel sink just inside the kitchen. He felt very awake and very far away at the same time, like someone hearing his name called at the top of a tall stair. "Listen," Hart said. He waited. The refrigerator fan droned in its slow cycle. From above, dim through floors and ducts, voices rose and fell, a hymn pulled tight through a practice session. The notes weren't words yet, just shapes of sound, but the tune found his bones. Abide with me, he thought, the way his daughter had spelled it in the diary, the melody that had drifted through her ceiling and into her hands. At the end of a verse, something metallic rattled, cart wheels over a seam. Hart tapped his notebook again. 213 cart. "Keys and a schedule," Hart whispered. "Someone who knows when to move and when to stop." He crouched to study the base of the door. The gap was thin. A curl of gray foam showed where the threshold met the hall. Hart poked it with the edge of the ruler. It gave like the belly of a fish. He raised his light and found more along the jamb, hand-cut pieces pressed into every crack where light might leak. Hand-cut, not factory, not neat, meant to hush the world. He lifted his radio to his mouth but didn't push the button. "Let's see it first," he said to the father or to himself. He worked the lock with a thin pick set he kept in a pouch smaller than a wallet. The father watched his hands move with the same slow care they had used on the diary. The lock resisted, then sighed, then turned. Hart eased the hasp free so it wouldn't clank, lifted the bar, and set both pieces down on the concrete as if laying a sleeping child into bed. He glanced up the hall once, then pulled the door. The smell came first, lime dust and the dry skin of cardboard. The flashlight found a crawlspace not much higher than a man's shoulders, walled with old pantry shelves and lined with more of that gray foam, cut with scissors and thumbtacked in rows. Empty jars sat in long lines like faces with their mouths sealed. He and Hart ducked and went in sideways, their shoulders scraping the old paint. Their breaths met in the flashlight beam and hung there, two ghosts forming one cloud. The beam found a ribbon pinned under a bent nail. Its color had been washed to bone by time, no longer pink or blue or red, just the absence of all. It had a crease where it must have been tied once, a memory of a bow. The father reached out, then stopped, the glove hovering an inch away. He saw a scene the way the diary showed them, small hands earning a prize for a spelling test, or losing one and keeping the ribbon anyway, hiding it where no one could take it. He felt the ache rise like a tide. Well, he took a picture instead. At the back of the crawl space, where the shelves met a wall of older wood, Hart pressed his palm flat. The sound changed, solid here, hollow there. He knocked. The echo came back quick and tight. He leaned his shoulder and felt give, then a catch. The flashlight showed a simple latch built from a scrap of angle iron and two screws. Hart looked at the father. The father nodded once. Hart lifted the latch and pushed. The space beyond narrowed and dipped, more like a throat than a room, and every surface wore the hand-cut foam, the kind they sell for cheap mattresses, trimmed with a kitchen knife. The father's mind supplied the missing picture. Someone standing right here with a utility blade, the scrape-scrape rhythm of it, the breath steady, the hum of a fan in the next room as a clock and a cloak. He reached for balance and put his hand on the sink when he backed out. The faucet turned a hair and coughed like an old smoker trying to clear his chest. Dirty water spat once and then ran clean. He gripped the basins, lipped the way a man grips the rail on a ship in heavy weather. Hart said the word gently, the way you touch a bruise. She was here. The father nodded. He couldn't say anything around the stone in his throat. He looked at the chalk on the jam again, the careful hash lines at a child's height and the ribbon pinned like a pressed leaf. He thought of soup and shoes on tile and a hymn that found its way through floorboards to a girl writing by the clock. He thought of keys and padlocks and foam cut to fit. He pictured a schedule tucked into a pocket right beside a ring of keys that clinked when a man walked, a sound so ordinary no one hears it until they know what it means. The refrigerator fan kicked down to a whisper, and for a moment the whole church seemed to listen with them. Then the hum returned, steady as breath, and the flashlight beam trembled just a little in his hand as if the past had reached out and steadied foam. The bus line ran like a vein through the town's quiet skin, and the names on the table felt like heartbeats that had stopped. By noon, the father and the detective were buried in paper. They worked in the records room where the fluorescent lights never rested. The bulbs buzzed like something living in the ceiling, and the air had that old library taste: dust, dried glue, the ghost of ink. Hart rolled out city maps and transit schedules, the kind printed in tiny numbers that dared you to miss a minute. The father spread the diary's penciled map beside them, its smudges soft as smoke. The pencil had been pressed hard in places, like a child bracing herself in the dark. Arrows curved along a thin gray line that matched the old Route 9 bus, the one that cut past shuttered mills and dead brick warehouses, and the two churches that fed half the town in winter. Hart set down a cardboard box marked with a code and the word girls in a tired hand. News clippings spilled like leaves after wind, 6 girls in 8 years. 6 school photo smiles, all with that same glassy flash in the eyes. The father's stomach went sour. He counted the years without meaning to. He watched the photos slowly cover the table until their faces touched. The town had turned patience into myth long ago, calling them angels, saints, the lost daughters of the river. Myth was easier than a timeline. Myth did not have a bus schedule. Start with times, Hart said. His voice sat low, steady. He pinned the diary's notes to the transit grid with pushpins. 211 hum, 213 wheels, 215 bell, 217 him. The father traced those numbers along the old line. At 208 the bus sat at the mills, half the route dark that year, the last shift already gone. At 212 it idled behind the second church by the alley with the blue door. At 214 the driver took his 2-minute break and smoked. He checked with a clerk who'd driven that line back then, retired now, hands shaking, memory like a good map with some stains. Quarter-hour whistle, the clerk had said. Old steam thing, you could set your watch. The father underlined whistle at 15 in thick black. He heard it now, a thin voice in the distance, the kind that skates over roofs. In the diary she had written whistle with 3 crooked lines coming off the word. Under it someone else had written in tidy block letters, wait for bell, blue door only. The father's glove squeaked against the paper as he moved the pushpin to the map's blue dot. Hart worked the case file with a butcher's care, carving out the pieces that still had meat on them. He pulled sign-in sheets from churches and laundries. He flagged a name that appeared in both columns on too many nights, a volunteer who always seemed to have a key, a truck, a reason to stay late. His pen tapped a slow rhythm on the table. Same signature, 8 different months, he said. Same block of time, always alone on cleanup, always no partner listed. He laid the sign-in sheet across the bus schedule, and the lines made a crosshatch that felt like a net tightening. The father followed the route on the big map with a red pencil. He marked the mills. He marked the corner where the storm drain swallowed leaves. He marked the alley where their shoes had squeaked on tile 2 nights before. He added a small X where a truck had left fresh gravel scars in the rain if the diary could be trusted. She had drawn little triangles by the wheel tracks like mountains to show how sharp the stones felt under her fingers. He could feel it too, nailing in the wet grit with a child's need to learn the world by touch. Boxes kept arriving. An officer with a gray mustache carried them in and left without a word, as if he were ashamed of delivering more past. Hart opened a file labeled Bus Route CHANGES Archive. Look, he said, 4 years in they shifted the night loop for Route 9 to run behind the church and the laundry because of construction. He slid the new line so it sat on top of the diary's pencil track. They matched. The father's heart did a small, hard kick. Newsprint laid its smell over everything. Headlines were soft from time. Where is PAIG? Vigil held for LILA, town PRAYS. The same sentences recycled with only names changed, the way grief repeats until it becomes the weather. Photos showed the same folding chairs, the same blue door open just enough to look friendly, the same volunteer moving chairs between shots, always in the corner, always with his ring of keys. Always smiling that mild, useful smile that said he was harmless, tireless. The man who would carry the coffee urn and lock up when everyone else went home. Hart made a small sound in his throat. He circled a block on the map where the bus stop lay under a dead streetlight. Quarter-hour whistle carries here, he said. The mill kept it on out of habit even after the last shift ended. People complained. They finally cut it 2 years ago, but back then it would have called time 3 times an hour if she's counting by that. He paused and wrote 2:15 in the margin, then drew a straight line to the alley behind the blue door. Bell at 2:15 plus 1 minute for the walk. She waits. Then the rattle, the wheels, the kitchen cart. The father made a new list. He wrote the 6 names in simple letters and put a small circle next to each. Paige, Leela, Monique, Aaron, Sana, Hope. He added dates and then the nearest bus lines. When he looked up, he saw the pattern as if the map had decided to show him its bones. Each girl had vanished within 2 blocks of Route 9 within a week when the volunteer had signed in at either the church kitchen or the laundry room at the community hall. The same signature, patient and neat. The same note beside it, lock up. He had known that name for years. He had said it over paper cups of coffee in fellowship halls. He had watched that man stack chairs with a soft grunt and shrug off thanks. He had shaken his hand at a vigil and felt the jingle of keys in his pocket and never thought it was a sound to fear. He had once told their daughter to ask that man for help if she ever got lost at church. The fluorescent light above him seemed to tilt. He swallowed until his throat hurt. Hart laid the volunteer's call card beside a delivery slip from the food bank. The words behind the blue door were scribbled there in a note to drivers. Hart underlined them until the paper fuzzed. Twice a week, he said, late drop-offs when soup lines were long, 1 driver on the late run. He pulled a photo from a clipping of a food drive and angled it under the light. There, he said, truck bed full of boxes, tread pattern deep and sharp, gravel will keep it. The father could hear rain in his memory again, the kind that makes little rivers along the curb. He pictured that truck easing into the alley with the engine low, laying new scars in the soft grit as if it were signing its name where only a careful eye would read it. He wrote gravel scars in his notebook and circled it twice. He kept his hand steady, but the red pencil left a heavy ring. The room grew smaller, papers crowded his elbows. The 6 school photos watched him from the table. The diary's penciled arrows seemed to move when he blinked. Hart stood still, listening the way good detectives listen to pipes, to the ugly hum of light, to a town's old machines. Then he turned his legal pad and pushed it toward the father. 1 name sat in the center with a square around it. The father stared until the letters blurred. He had written that name himself on sign-up sheets for coat drives and pancake breakfasts. He had circled it with gratitude once. Now he circled it with his jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. 6 girls, Hart said, quiet as a pew whisper. 8 years, 1 route, 1 schedule. 1 man who is always early, always last to leave, always there with chairs and keys. The fluorescent light buzzed on, relentless as guilt. The father picked up the red pencil again and drew 1 more circle around the name, darker this time, until the paper dented. He felt the bus line thrum under the map like a wire pulled too tight. He pictured the blue door, the padlock, the chalk marks on the jamb at a child's height. He thought of a whistle at the quarter hour and a cart that rattled, and a diary that had learned the town's pulse long before he had. Then he set the pencil down and said the name out loud, each syllable steady, as if speaking it could make the map start telling the truth. The night sat heavy on the town like a hand, and the sirens moved in slow loops, counting out a storm no one understood. In the diary, she wrote the air felt thick, like you had to push it away just to breathe. He heard her voice in the blocky letters. The page said a flashlight crawled like a worm along the ceiling, thin and pale, searching for a crack. She drew the beam as a narrow line that bent at the corners and skittered across plaster. She wrote the pipe sang when the basement flooded, a low metal song that made the floor hum under her feet. She timed the sirens by tapping the spine of the book with her thumb 14 minutes between each wail. 14, 14, 14. On that night 33 years ago, the world outside had kept time for her, even when no one else did. He remembered that sound, blue and red blurred on wet brick, radios hissed like sea foam in a shell. The storm pushed water up through the storm drains and pressed it against doors. He could feel the old damp creep into the bones of the house even now. When he closed his eyes, he could see a flashlight again, slicing his living room like a blade, cutting pictures out of the darkness and setting them down with cold hands. He folded the diary shut and carried it out into rain that tasted like iron. Detective Hart had given him a name and an address. The retired patrolman lived in a small house with a sloping porch and a sagging awning, the kind of place where wind chimes sound tired. Inside, the living room smelled of old coffee and menthol rub. A square clock ticked on the wall like a metronome with a cough. The television played a game show with the sound low. A folded police jacket lay across a chair, gray at the cuffs. The old patrolman had a face like a weathered fence, honest wood split by time. He opened the door and stood aside, not exactly glad to see him but not ready to send him away either. "I remember the night," he said, voice rough as if he had been chewing on gravel. "Storm like a freight train, phones went weird, lots of calls, nothing clear." He did not ask for the man's name, he knew it, he knew the house. He knew the missing poster that had curled in his cruiser's window all those years. They sat on a couch that had the shape of a person who used to sit there every afternoon. The father held his hat in his lap. His knuckles whitened around the brim. He set the diary on the coffee table but did not open it yet. He needed the man to speak first, to say his own dates and hours before the pages did. "Miscommunications," the patrolman said, and the word lay on the rug like a spill. "Dispatch rerouted us twice. We were down a car because Mills Road flooded by the bridge. Shift change came early because one kid had the flu and another got stuck on a burglary out by the river." He rubbed menthol into his wrist as he talked, as if the joint itself still remembered the old ache of that night. "We made a run through your block on the quarter hour. Siren to clear late drivers. Lights on the roofs, yes. We passed the church, we passed the laundry. We saw folks stacking sandbags behind the blue door." The father's mouth went dry. "Who?" he asked. "A good man," the patrolman said at once, too fast. "Always pitched in at the shelter, always had a key when nobody else could find one. He waved us off, said he had it handled, said they were just moving boxes off the floor." He swallowed. "We had other calls, we moved on." The father opened the diary then because the room had turned into the flood he had feared and he needed a raft. He showed the old man the pressed, neat rules written in a third hand: no noise when the fan starts, wait for the bell, blue door only. He showed him the times. 2:11 hum, 2:13 wheels, 2:15 one bell. "Your log," the father said, voice thin and steady. "You wrote sirens ran every 14 minutes. You logged a pass at 2:15 exactly." The patrolman looked at the page and then at the clock above the TV, as if the ticking there might save him. He set his jaw. "We signal every quarter hour in a storm," he said. "Standard sweep. Let folks know we're near. It doesn't mean we touch every door." "You touched the blue door?" the father asked. "We saw the blue door," the patrolman said. He rubbed his hand across his mouth. "We saw it open. We saw the good man there and we believed him. He helped set up cots for the women after the mill closed. He kept the coffee hot. He knew where the fuses were. You know how it is. There are people who are always there. You stop seeing them as risk." The father's fingers dug into the felt of his hat brim, making a soft flaw there, a dent that would not smooth. He remembered the chalk marks at a child's height on the jamb by that door. He remembered the foam cut by hand and pinned around a crawlspace that led to the dark. He remembered the ribbon washed to bone, pinned under a bent nail. The storm had sung through those pipes, and she had written the music down while men with keys moved carts and said everything was fine. "Your flashlight," the father said. She wrote it crawled along the ceiling like a worm. The patrolman's eyes closed. "We shined lights through windows. We didn't kick doors. We were told to hold until backup. Backup got lost by the mills. Radios," he gestured at the air. "Hiss and spit and nothing clear. Could we have done more? Yes, we should have done more." His jaw tensed again. We were told the church was secure. We chose to believe that and move. Because the good man said so. He said he'd lock up. The patrolman's voice dropped. He had the keys. The room ticked. The game show audience clapped soundlessly on the TV. A storm memory rolled through the father so hard he had to brace his palm against his knee to stay in the chair. Blue against brick, red spinning slow on the church's wet sign, radios hissing like sea foam. The song the pipes sang when the basement flooded, a low moan through the bones of the building. She had measured that song with her small hand while the world passed by in 14-minute arcs. Hart had warned him this might happen. Old men defend old knights, not because they are evil, but because the story has set hard and their hands can't find a fresh edge. The father watched the patrolman untwist his fingers from the arm of the couch and smooth a line that wasn't there. He saw the shame move under the skin of the face. He did not try to drag it out into the light. He let the man sit with it. You could have opened the blue door, the father said, and there was no anger in it, only the sound of a thing that has finally learned its name. You could have asked to see the floor. The patrolman looked at the diary again, at the child's neat numbers and the tidy command someone else had pressed into the page. He breathed in through his nose like a man smelling smoke far away. "We will put this in the record," he said. "We should have done it then. We will do it now." The father stood. His knees felt old, but he stood tall. He put on his hat and held the diary close to his chest. By the door, his hand paused on the knob. He turned back once. He wasn't a good man, he said. He was a man with keys and a schedule. Outside, the rain had thinned to a soft thread. A distant siren rolled across the roofs, rose and fell and slid into quiet. He didn't time it. He didn't need to. The diary had become a clock, and every page was a bell tolling for an hour no one kept. He walked down the steps into the silver light and for a long moment stood under the low hum of a street lamp while moths tapped the glass like timid knuckles, as if asking the town to wake and keep watch this time. The permit said there was one basement in the house. The floor said there were two. Paint peeled from the siding in sad curls, and the mailbox hung by a single rusted screw like it was too tired to hold the mail. The rental sign out front had been there so long the phone number had faded to a ghost. Detective Hart checked his folder, then the door, then the father. "Landlord gave consent," he said you can have the place if it helps. The father nodded, though the word help felt sharp in his mouth. The case stuck, then turned. The door opened on a stale smell, old carpet, old smoke, and something sweet gone wrong. Inside, the rooms were thin with second-hand furniture. A couch that remembered other people's naps, a lamp with a crooked shade, a picture hook in the wall with no picture left. In the kitchen, a small freezer hummed with a steady throat. It sat where a table should have been, pressed up against a wall in a way that made no sense. Hart clicked his pen. Permit from the city says the original house had a partial cellar under the kitchen. Access by trapdoor, he said, tapping the plan. When he pulled permits for repairs 20 years ago, he sealed it and made one new stair by the back door. He looked up. That's what the paper says. The father stepped closer to the freezer. The hum ticked into his bones. The paint on the wall behind it had a different sheen, flatter, newer. The trim showed a faint seam, a line so straight it could only be a lie. Fresh screws bit into old wood, heads bright against a century of scuffs. He put on gloves and ran a fingertip along the seam. The line ran down, across, then up again, like a door someone had drawn and then dared you to find. He glanced at Hart. Hart nodded once, a steady nod, the kind you give right before you pull something that might break. They slid the freezer forward. Its feet left 4 small moons in the dirt on the vinyl. The hum changed pitch, angry at the move. Behind it, paint had been brushed over a crack in quick strokes. Hart lifted a putty knife and worked the edge. The blade slipped in and whispered. "Seam," he said. He pressed. The wood shifted. He pressed again. The hidden panel popped free with a tired sigh and swung an inch. Cold air breathed out, sour cold, the kind that eats your breath and gives nothing back. The space behind was narrow. Steps turned and fell away into dark. The father swallowed and tasted metal. The railing was new wood screwed into old plaster, and when he gripped it, the banister complained in a long ache. "Slow," Hart said. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam crawled down the stair like the thin worm she once drew along a ceiling. At the bottom, the floor changed, old concrete poured thin and rough, hairline cracks mapping it like a dried river. The air was so still it felt heavy. He heard the house above them talk in small sounds, the freezers hum, the tick of a pipe settling, the whisper of their own coats. Hart's light found a wall and then the marks, penciled ticks climbed from a child's knee to a child's shoulder and stopped. Each line had a date beside it, some faded to gray, some still dark. The last one ended low, too low for the years that had passed. The father reached out and didn't touch. His vision narrowed as if the room were a tunnel, and he had to crawl through his eyes to get to the end. There was a bed in the corner, a narrow frame with a thin mattress, the sheet tucked with care. A chipped teacup sat on a crate like a nightstand. A cartoon rabbit wore off the glaze where lips had found it over and over. Beside the cup lay a book of word searches with only a few words circled, as if the person had tried to learn to hunt for hidden things and then quit. On the far wall, someone had scratched short lines into paint. 5, then a slant. 5, then a slant, tally marks. The diary had called it a room with no clock. Time had found a way in any way and left scars where a clock should have hung. Hart spoke low. Photos, he said, more to the air than to the father. He shot the marks, the bed, the cup, the ladder-back chair. He measured the height ticks with a ruler and set the numbers down in neat rows. He breathed through his mouth because smell is a kind of memory, and this one did not deserve a place to live. The father stood by the bed and stared at the pillowcase worn thin in the shape of a small head and thought about breathing. How many breaths make a life? How many were taken here without a window to count against? A vent sat high on the wall, gridded with dust. It wasn't connected to any duct the permit mentioned. It looked like a fake window drawn in metal. The father lifted a chair, set it beneath, and climbed. Hart steadied the legs. The vent screws came loose too easy, like someone had opened it many times. He pulled the grill free and looked down the throat. Lint, gray and soft, clogged the gap. He scooped a handful and felt something hard. He eased it out slow, like lifting a fish from a net. A charm bracelet lay in his glove, dulled by dust, tiny shapes along its chain, a star, a shoe, a bell, a book. He held it up. The light found the bell and made it glint, one bright note without sound. The father's knees went warm and weak. The stare behind him tilted in his eyes. He reached for the railing and the banister complained again, a long wooden sigh. He tasted the old freezer hum in his teeth. He thought of the diary's rules in tidy print: no noise when the fan starts, wait for the bell, blue door only. He thought of that bell on the bracelet and how it might have once rung on a small wrist, a sound like hope. Hart bagged the charm bracelet in a clean sleeve. Found in vent, he said, and wrote the time. They moved slow through the room, calling out each piece so memory would have to listen. A pair of socks folded into a ball, a crayon nub blue like the door that had kept her. A calendar from a year nobody remembered, all its months blank. On the back of the door, not a real door, only a panel someone had made to look like one. Someone had drawn a square in pencil and written clock above it. The outline was rubbed with the shapes of fingertips. He saw her standing there, pressing her hands to the fake clock and trying to push time into the wall. Hart found a small mirror taped to a stud low to the ground. The silver had blackened at the edges. It reflected their flashlight in a thin slice. He lifted it and saw tape marks where it had been moved up, then down, then up again, as if someone had changed their mind about how tall the mirror should be. The father stared at his own face in that narrow reflection and almost didn't know the man looking back. He saw the years under his eyes, the night set there like stones. He needed air, even the sour kind. He stepped back to the stair and leaned his shoulder into the wall. Above, the freezer hummed without care, keeping its own time. Behind him, the tally marks kept counting long after the counting stopped. He ran his gloved thumb over one of the low lines and felt the grit of graphite. She learned to keep time without a clock, he said. His voice sounded like it came from the far end of a hall. Hart stood beside him. He built a second basement, he said. Made a room that wasn't on any plan. Paper says one, house says two. He looked around, steady eyes taking in every small thing. We'll put this room on the record, he said. It won't be hidden anymore. They climbed back up one careful step at a time. The panel swung shut with a soft click. The freezer's hum settled back into its steady throat like a person finishing a long sentence. In the kitchen light, the charm bracelet in its bag looked small enough to lose in a pocket. The father slid it into a larger pouch and sealed it. The plastic wrinkled with the sound of rain. Outside, wind worried the rental sign until it squealed on its wire. Inside, the house settled but did not relax. When they stepped onto the porch, the air felt raw and clean on his face. He looked at the peeling paint, the tired mailbox, the rusted screw, and he thought of time, how it hides in seams and still leaves marks you can feel with your thumb. He closed his eyes and listened to the freezer hum through the wall until it turned from noise into seconds, and he promised himself he would keep each one. The coffee tin rattled like a small animal when they lifted it from the back of the cupboard, and the father knew before the lid turned that it wasn't beans inside, it was a voice. They found it wrapped in plastic and old rubber bands that snapped like dry twigs. Inside, a microcassette lay face up, its tiny screws winking under the kitchen light. The label had once been white, now it was the color of a smoker's teeth. Hart set it in a battered handheld recorder he kept for days like this. He clicked play and the room filled with a soft sea of hiss, the sound of old tape coming back to life. Then the voice arrived, low, rough, gravel dragged through cloth. A blue door, it said, almost tender. Wait for the bell, quiet feet. The father's breath caught. He gripped the edge of the counter until the laminate dented under his fingers. In the background, the tape held a world, a fan with a wobble that thumped once each turn, a chain dragged over concrete, a hymn far away thinned by ducks to a ghost of sound. A chair leg scraped, keys settled. The voice went on, patient and careful like a teacher who likes to be obeyed. Count to 10 when the fan starts, no noise at 4, left hand on the rail, blue door only. Hart stopped the tape and rolled it back with his thumb. Again, he said. The father shook his head. The word broke. Hart pressed play anyway. The rules came out in the same order, each one pressed deep into the tiny strip of brown plastic. Between them lived the building itself, the rattle of a cart wheel hitting a seam, the metal cough of a freezer starting, that faint hymn that slipped through as if the tape had remembered a ceiling and could not let it go. The voice swallowed a clump of words and tried again. On quiet feet, it said, slower, no creak, wait for bell. Somewhere over the hiss, a number fell apart and reformed. 25K, the voice muttered, as if talking to itself, half swallowed by static, half caught by the tape before shame pulled it back. Hart rewound 5 seconds, then 10, and listened with his eyes closed. He wrote on the back of an envelope in blunt block print. Could be a plate, he said. Could be a habit, saying it to remember. He looked up. We match it to a year, we find a van. They took the recorder to a side room where the light was softer and the wall clock ticked like a calm heart. Hart passed the father one ear of the headphones and kept the other for himself. Together they leaned into the hiss. The tape gave them scraps like a radio trying to climb out of a storm. 2-5, the voice said, then what might have been a letter, then a cough. The chain dragged again. The fan thumped. Hart scribbled 3 versions of the number and circled 2. We'll search by sound, he said. A year range, color, roots. The father nodded. He couldn't trust his tongue. The tape hiss stayed under his ribs even when Hart clicked stop. It was the same hiss he had heard in patrol cars 33 years ago, the same thin thread of noise that ran under prayers and promises like a hidden river. He watched Hart call in the guesses, watched him ask for records from the yard where bad cars go to die, watched him listen to a clerk's tired voice and write down an address by the river. The junkyard sat where the town let go of itself, behind the mills, past the tracks, down a road the city forgot to fix. The river licked at the stacks of tires, slow and brown, the way an animal licks a wound it knows will never close. Crows heckled from the black line of power poles, their voices like rusty hinges. The gate complained as they pushed through. Oil and rain made a strange perfume, sweet and sharp. A dog lifted its head and watched them with cloudy eyes, then set its chin back on its paws as if nothing the living did could surprise it anymore. Here, the yard man said, his breath a fog that smelled of coffee and cheap mints. Blue van came in last spring. No engine, half a door. Thought I'd keep the tires, but they're dry rot. He led them through rows of quiet wrecks, past a sedan with its face smashed in, past a truck with a bed full of shattered glass that looked like a frozen pond. The van waited near the far fence, skeletal and stubborn, its paint the exact tired blue from the child's drawings, the color of a sky that refuses to clear. The father stopped a few steps away. The color pulled at him like a hand. In the tape, the voice had said the words like a blessing, blue door, and now he saw that shade on a vehicle meant to be ordinary. He touched the side with the back of his glove. The paint flaked, soft as ash. Rust had eaten crescents around the wheel wells. The passenger door held a dent near the handle, the kind that comes from a ring of keys hitting the same place over and over for years. Hart crouched by the front and looked for the tag. No plate. The screws remained, two bad teeth in a mouth that had something torn from it. He lay on his back and slid his shoulder under the bumper, flashlight held tight between cheek and shoulder. He did not need the father to ask what he saw. The sound of his breath told it. Lift, he said. Wheel well first. The rubber felt dead under their hands. Grease turned the world black to the wrist. The father's glove found only grit and the slime of old rain. Hart's light crept along the curve, searching for anything that remained. Midway up, something pale broke the tardark. Hold, Hart said. He worked with two fingers, slow, careful, the way you free a moth trapped in a screen. He eased out a scrap of notebook paper fossilized by grease. The blue lines still showed through the dirt. It had been folded small once, then pressed flat by time. He slid it into a clear bag before the air could steal more of it. The father watched his own breath fog the plastic. Hart pinched the corner and turned it, light at just the right angle. Three words leaned across the scrap in a child's careful hand. I am listening. The father felt the ground shift. The river noise went distant, then near, then far again. He reached for the bag and held it like something hot. The letters were neat and stubborn, each one trying to sit up straight in the grease. He heard her voice in those words, the one that had learned to read the town by sound, the one that had counted sirens and fans and the cough a freezer makes when it wakes. I am listening, a promise from a room with no clock. Hart stood and looked into the van's open mouth. The back held nothing but shadows, and yet the air coming out felt crowded with old movement. The floor had narrow scars where a cart had once slid, long and straight, the metal kisses of wheels that felt their way by night. On the inner door, the paint was rubbed in one oval patch at child height, the size of two hands pressed together. Hart photographed it, then set his camera down and just stood, as if the van itself might finish a sentence if given a chance. The yard man cleared his throat. We crush on Fridays, he said, softer now, if you need it kept. We need it, Hart said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The crows fell silent for a breath, as if even they respected the word. They pulled up the rubber mat and found one more thing, a hair ribbon ground into the jigsaw of metal, its color washed to bone, the same way every bright thing fades here. Hart bagged it and wrote the date. The father took one last look at the paint, how stubbornly it held, how faithfully it matched the shade on the door the town had trusted. He thought of the cassette hiss and the heavy words, blue door, quiet feet, wait for the bell, and a muttered plate half swallowed that still led them here. Back at the car, the father sat with the scrap in his lap, the plastic crinkling when he breathed. The river licked at the tire stacks. The crows started up again, rude as men. A far train horn moaned, then fell apart in the wind. He pressed his thumb to the bag where the words lay, careful not to smear the grease pattern that had saved them. I am listening. It felt like a message sent forward to someone who might finally hear it. He closed his eyes and let the hiss of the tape come back. The small fans wobble like a limping heart, the chain dragging like a sigh across concrete. When he opened them, the blue van sat still and empty, but the three words glowed against the gray like a match cupped in small hands. He lifted the bag to the light and promised her without speaking that he would keep listening until every door opened and every clock in this story learned how to tell the truth. Before the sun came up, the church garden gave up what it had been holding, but not the thing he most feared. The ground opened like a held breath, and what it offered was colder than bones. Floodlights washed the grass in a hard white pool. Cords snaked like black veins from a sputtering generator. The air had that wet dirt smell that rises before dawn, clean on top, sour underneath. Detective Hart stood near the blue door, hands in his coat pockets, breathing steam. The father waited at the tape line, gloved fingers closed around the diary bag as if it were a hand he could still hold. The garden looked harmless in daylight, raised beds, a crooked scarecrow hat, a row of time gone woody, but the ground didn't lie. Men in Tyvek knelt in the soft rectangle where a shed had once stood and worked with trowels that made a small, steady scrape like mice behind a wall. Slow, Hart said, though no one needed the reminder. An evidence tech lifted a top layer of soil onto a screen and shook it. Pebbles ticked through the mesh. The father heard the sound and thought of rain on a metal roof, nights when sirens turned the town into a clock. A cadaver dog paced at the edge of the lights, nose up, then down, then up again, working the cold wind. Every few minutes a radio hissed and whispered and went quiet, the station's voice thin as sea foam. They found the channel first. It was narrow and mean, a pressed path under the fence, barely big enough for a small body to slide. The dirt along the sides was smooth, like palms had polished it on the way through. A child-sized trench pointed toward the alley, toward the sound of the river when it's working hard after rain. The tech leaned in and aimed his light. There, he said softly, the beam showed fabric. A torn blanket lay folded by chance into a neat wedge, one corner chewed by damp and time. He lifted it with both hands, gentle as you lift a sleeping child. Threads trailed like hair. A biscuit tin came next, flattened along one side as if a heel had stepped on it hard and then left it buried to hide the dent. The painted lid was scratched. A red house, a winter tree, a smiling girl in an apron holding a plate of cookies that had stopped looking delicious a long time ago. The tin rattled when the tech moved it, the sound dry and secret. He worked the lid loose. Inside, bundles lay side by side like little animals sleeping. Hair, not one color, not one child. Locks tied with ribbon faded to the pale of old tea. The father felt the world tilt. He could smell shampoo that wasn't there, and sugar that should have been, and bleach that had always been. Hart didn't swear. He had learned to keep his mouth still when the past stepped out of the dark. He nodded once and the tech started to bag the tin. Ritual, Hart said, quiet and tired. He practiced this like prayer. The father stepped back into the cold and let it bite him. He had spent years braced for a shovel to find what no one wanted to see. He had imagined bones under roses, a name ending with a nod from a man in a jacket. But the ground gave only the root, the scraps, the proof that hands had been busy in the night. No remains. Relief came like a gasp, and with it a different ache. The earth had told them how. It would not tell them who was left or where she had gone. They kept digging. They traced the crawl to where it widened, then ended in a collapse of roots. No bodies, no teeth. Only the story of a small person moving through the dark toward the alley, toward the river's breath. When the light in the east began to thin the sky, Hart touched the father's sleeve. "Go home," he said. "Sleep 2 hours, then come back." The house met him with its old habits. The hallway bulb buzzed, tired as ever. The floor moaned at the middle plank. He meant to lie down, but the sound pulled him along like a thread. He stopped where the first diary had waited under the warped board, and he let his fingers find the seam again. Dust lifted and hung in the air like smoke. He knelt. He slid his hand along the beam until skin met a notch he didn't remember. Not a crack, more like a pocket made by careful thumbs. Something thin lived there. He pinched and pulled. A folded page came free, stiff with age, edges dark. He sat on the step and opened it with the care a person uses on wings. The ink had bled in places, the way rain sneaks under doors and stains the threshold. The date at the top made his chest go empty. Months after the town had stopped searching, after the flyers came down, after neighbors stopped bringing casseroles to a house that smelled like bleach and burned coffee. Her neat hand had changed, still careful but sharper, as if the letters had learned how to run. She wrote, "Door left open for the rain." She underlined rain twice. Counted to 10 for the fan, quiet feet, waited for the bell. Then she wrote, "I smelled the river. I went that way." Her small sentences knew how to make a map without drawing one. The page held her breath between the lines, steady on the edge of flight. Halfway down, a sentence stopped and started again. "Forgive me for what I must leave behind." Below it she had drawn a square and written the word clock inside, then crossed it out and written window. Under that, "I am listening." The same stubborn promise they had pried from a van's wheel well. The words looked older here more than a note. A vow set into wood and hidden like treasure. He read it through once, then again, and on the third time the house seemed to lean in and listen with him. He heard the storm in the bones of the place, the thin song pipes sing when the basement floods, the small creak that woke him the night she was gone. All those sounds had been clocks, and he had not known the hour. She had known. She had kept time in a room with no clock and waited for a door to be left open for the rain. He carried the page to the kitchen table and laid it beside the bagged ribbon tin in his mind. The air tasted of varnish and memory. He pressed his palms flat on the wood until the shake settled. He could hear Hart's voice from the garden, from the van, from the records room, keys and a schedule. He closed his eyes and saw the crawl channel under time, a torn blanket, a dented tin. He saw the blue door standing a finger wide for a flood. He saw the alley shining with fat raindrops, and the night holding its breath while small feet moved like prayer. By the time he walked back to the church, first light had taken hold. The lamps were going out. The floodlights sighed and dimmed one by one. The cold air was clean as glass and it made every breath a good thing. Techs zipped bags, radios murmured. Someone wrote a case number on a fresh tag and tore the strip with a brisk, paper-dry sound. The garden looked ordinary again, except for the square of turned earth that no one would plant this spring. Hart met him at the tape. The detective's eyes were red at the rims, not from tears but from hours. "No remains," he said, "but the path is true." The father nodded and handed him the page. Hart read it and let the words sit in his open hand for a long time. He touched the date with a pen cap. "Months after," he said. "She got a chance. She took it." "As she went by the river," the father said. His voice felt simple, new. "She chose a direction." He stepped past the tape and turned his face toward the water. He couldn't see the river from the garden, but he could smell it, metal and mud and the old, cold breath that slides along brick. He knew which alley held the fastest drip after rain, which curb stayed slick, which drains sang. He had learned the town's voice the way she had, one sound at a time. It wasn't an answer. It was a direction. He stood in the clear morning and let it point him. The first light touched the blue door and made it look almost kind. He knew better now, but he didn't look away. He tucked the last page back into its bag and held it close. Somewhere a bell gave a single thin ring, and he thought, not yes, not no, but go. He breathed in the cold and stepped forward, the glass-bright air breaking softly around him as if making room.